questionable oil and gas reserves. Venezuela, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and other countries. It's a pleasure having Professor Cleveland Jones, researcher at ENOG, geoscience and geopolitics consultant. Good afternoon. Have a good new year, Professor Cleveland Jones.
Yes, good year to you too, Cavagna. Let's have many more programs. They've all been very exciting throughout the year of 2023.
Perfect. Fantastic. Please, Professor. This table shows the 5 most important reserves in the world by country. Are they reliable numbers?
Yeah, that's the problem. I think that table is like from Wiki, and Wiki uses
Yeah.
BP and EIEA and EIA and Rystad and all of these consultancies that provide estimates, which are all kind of based on similar information, and then they tweak them. And the problem is the primary data that they use is not very reliable. So no matter what you do in terms of massaging the data, you're not going to get very reliable numbers. So this is a table that has persisted over several years, more or less in that order and that order of magnitude. And unfortunately, no, the numbers are not reliable. But the thing is that there's, of course, many countries that declare reserves. And when you total all of them, some of them might be up, some of them might be down in terms of some adjustments that we should make. But, as I basically conclude, we have no reason to panic, but we certainly have reason to doubt the numbers, especially of the major players. And that's where a lot of the problems are.
But do
Let me
they
say
follow?
this.
Yeah,
Huh?
sure. No. The question is, do they follow some standards like geological
Well,
specifications and so?
SP is the standard. And of course, the US and Canada and a few other countries follow that. Even Brazil follows that. But many other countries don't. And if you don't have transparency in the declarations, it doesn't matter if they say, oh, we follow SPE standards. We know they don't, because, the information they provide is absolutely inconsistent with the declared exploration work that they do and the production that they draw down from their reserves. The numbers have to add up. If you have 10 and you produce 1 and you discover half, you should have 9.5. And if that doesn't add up, then obviously the numbers are not reliable. And unfortunately, they're not reliable for almost all countries. That's really the problem. It's crazy. A while back,
We have a small technical problem, but hope here he can return soon. Yeah,
or
we
to
have a problem.
produce more of the OPEC share, each
Uh-huh.
country has a very strong incentive to say, hey, my reserves are very big, so I should have a big share. And then Saudi Arabia says, my reserves are gigantic, I should have
The
a big share.
biggest.
Kuwait says, oh, but my reserves are 20 billion more. In Iraq, in Iran, everybody plays that game. And all of a sudden, everybody is declaring 2 times what is reasonable, or what the SPE methodology would suggest. And that's a big problem. And without transparency, you just can't
Perfect.
double check the numbers. But we know that the exaggeration is there, unfortunately.
And did you bring reliable numbers for us in your pictures?
Well, no, just like you were presenting, this slide, which is about what yours is, goes down to I think it's 100 countries. And then you look at some countries that have, under 1 billion barrels in reserves and so on. And if you look at those countries with relatively small reserves, you would say, well, it's so easy to do the numbers right because they don't have that many fields and so on. But even those countries, you'll go down, Ecuador and many other countries that are in the top 20 already have smaller reserves, and they're still don't add up. So then I would suggest that independent researchers like Rystad, for example, is probably a better source, even though I have big differences from their analysis than what the numbers that everybody is mentioning, because these are the numbers that are accepted. BP in their annual energy review, and the EIA and the IEA, they all mention very similar numbers. So they're working from the same thing, and it just doesn't add up. What the problems arise is with the big reserves, because the countries that have 500 million barrels, they're not going to make a big difference in the world. But the
Mhm.
countries that have 50, 100, 200, 300 billion, that's where the problems are. And that's really, uh, I've been saying this for, I don't know, almost 10 years. Just cannot accept the numbers, and we should demand, the industry should demand to have a review of these numbers, because, for example, Venezuela is part of OPEC, and OPEC is just happy to let Venezuela show 300 billion barrels, which is
And do they have do
astronomically.
they have do they have this
No,
volume?
it's astronomically exaggerated. Let me, for example, if we're going to talk about Venezuela, Venezuela has been assessed by the U.S. Geological Service, and they're very good at assessing based on fundamental information, and they assess by areas. They have this large red area and this smaller blue area. The smaller blue area is the Orinoco Belt. And that's where the problem is, because Venezuela is basing 250 or more billion barrels of their reserves on the Orinoco Belt, which is absolutely, you know, extra heavy oil. Not only that, but of very difficult extraction, and it requires extreme amounts of diluents that they have to import. So all kinds of restrictions would come in to make those resources not count as reserves. Reserves have to be technically producible and economically viable. If one of those things doesn't work, it's not reserves, it's
So
resources, it's
so
oil in the ground.
so do you mean that the quality of the oil, the reserves, is important? The quality sometimes not so good as the Venezuela case.
Well, even when the quality is bad in some countries, they say, okay, the oil is very bad quality, so we have a lot of it, but we're only going to be able to produce 5% because it's so difficult. Okay, that's reasonable, but that's not the case. In Venezuela, the recovery factor that they've estimated of their total resources is 35%. That's extremely high. That's as high as some of the good offshore reservoirs, fields in the Gulf of Mexico and even Brazil. Of course, Norway has some fields that they've taken 50, 60%, but smaller fields, high technology, the North Sea next to Europe, that's a different
And when,
story.
when when we compare with Brazil, is 20 something our recoverable?
Yeah, I mean the Brazilian resources that count as reserves are absolutely compliant with SPE guidelines, so they are technically recoverable and economically viable at close to market prices. In fact, in Brazil, the reserves are probably down to 40 or $50 or less. So obviously they are economically viable at 70 some dollars that we have now, and certainly at 100. And they're obviously technically recoverable. Most of them are offshore, well-known recovery techniques. In Venezuela, that's not the case. They've been fighting for years. The Russians and then Chevron doing some extraction. They can't get more than 100,000 barrels, and that's an extreme effort, and certainly the costs may still make it economically viable, but it's barely. And of course, they're only taking the best of the best. So all of that Orinoco Belt, basically, I would suggest that, half or more, you can just wipe off the records, because that doesn't count at all. If you do a review field by field like the USGS did, you would probably end up with 30 or 40, maybe 50 billion barrels of reserves in Venezuela, as opposed to
Wow,
the 300 that they
my God,
declare. That's a
six times,
tremendous. difference.
6 times more.
That's what I'm saying. It's absurd. And it's absurd that the entire oil and gas community is just fine with that. Everybody knows that those numbers are fake, but no one is really complaining. And I think you have to have some measure of demanding that those declarations bear some relationship to reality. Otherwise, the whole system falls apart. Now, those reserves are never going to be produced. Those supposed reserves. They're just resources in the ground that are never going to be produced. They're going to stay there. Now, the offshore reserves, sure, in Venezuela, they're probably going to be produced at great difficulty because Venezuela suffers from a lot of impairments and so on. So,
But
given the geopolitics, which is
sure.
not counted in the reserves estimation, I think a lot of those reserves won't be produced anyway, even if there are reserves and they could technically be
But
produced. They might be
but
economical, but they're just not
but,
going to be produced.
but Cleveland isn't there an entity, international entity that make auditings in this process and to say the truth?
That's what I'm saying. For example, OPEC itself says that we certify that Venezuela says it's 300 billion barrels. OPEC is fine with that. That's who basically is saying that those reserves are there. The countries vouch for that, and then OPEC says, "Oh, if you're a member, yeah, that's fine. We believe you." But the international community, IEA, for example, should say, "Hey, wait a second. That's not good enough. We have to have reliable numbers, not just declaration numbers. Everybody can declare I have 100 billion barrels, but you have to show how you got there." Back when they did those calculations, and they were done by reliable entities, American entities, but back then the oil price was very high. Venezuela was still not in major problems, and the unconventional resources looked like they were going to be the savior. So they ended up certifying those reserves. But if conditions change, those certifications are not valid anymore. The conditions are such that those reserves are not either technically producible nor economically viable. So just wipe them off the records. A lot of countries, Brazil, for example, adjusts their its reserves up and down also for adjustment factors,
Yeah,
because if you
yeah.
say these reserves that we calculated last year, oh, we're going to have a problem with this field, so take that 100 million barrels off. But on this field, our recovery factor, we can count 30% instead of 25. Those adjustments you can do every year, but you have to show how and why, and because in another similar field you're having good recovery factor, but the recovery factors they're using are just uh, impossible.
And
Another one, um,
mhm,
let
sure,
me just jump here.
sure,
Russia,
sure.
you know, giant country, of course. Resources are spread over many geographical areas and different kinds of resources. Unconventional resources, Basnov, shale plays, and the other oil plays. But again, lack of transparency and technically recoverable is in my view very questionable. So for in Russia's case, maybe I would take away uh, a good amount of the unconventional resources that they count as reserves, and probably a good portion of the low producing fields that are just not economically viable in the next 5 years or so. And you have to say, hey, I'm sorry, those are not going to count as reserves. So Russia may end up with maybe another 40 or 50 billion barrels, but not the 200 or whatever they
200.
want to claim.
And Cleveland, do they need international companies to make part of the
No,
exploration production process, like
no.
Schlumberger, Halliburton? No,
As a
they
matter
are
of fact,
independent.
no, they don't need it because right now Russia is producing with all kinds of restrictions and so on. And of
Sanctions.
course, they're going to have a lot of trouble going forward because maybe the ongoing production, they can still hold 10, 11, whatever, but it's going to be more and more difficult. They don't rely on any okay from anybody, but the sanctions and the restrictions on
Oh, oh, we lost your your voice, your sound is not here yet. Let's see some technical problem. Sorry.
I wanted to talk about Russia because Russia, in my view, is almost as bad a case as Venezuela. It's just that it's not right now at that point. It's in the next 5 years or certainly 10 years that the realization will come up that all the 70% of those reserves are just not there. That's a big chunk off world reserves.
You
Very
you
important
may
chunk.
Yeah, you mentioned that they have different plays, different source in the non-country.
Yeah,
What does it mean?
they have some super fields. They have super fields, and those will probably be producing for years. But they don't have anymore the fields that were producing 30, 40,000 barrels a day per well. That's long gone. They have good wells still in some fields, 10,000 barrels a day and so on, but they have thousands, literally over 200,000 wells, and many thousands of those wells are producing under 50 barrels a day, maybe
Wow,
30 barrels a day.
the
Those
costs.
yeah, those fields with that kind of well is just not viable. So that falls into the economic viability.
Yeah,
Even in Russia, paying in rubles and all that, it's very difficult. And if you consider technical viability, even those fields require maintenance. And if you have sanctions, it's going to be very difficult. It's all up in the air. And I think the cautious, prudent, reasonable course of action is to say, they have to do that reevaluation. They have no interest in it, and certainly, no Western entity can go in there and reevaluate things. But we, looking from above, can say, write off 70% of those reserves in all calculations because they're not economically viable nor technically recoverable. So they shouldn't count.
and
Um,
the type of oil that they have is
they
associated
have
with gas or
No,
gas
they
is
of
different.
course they have large gas fields, and those probably will exist for a good while, maybe with technical restrictions because of sanctions. But they have heavy oil, which I think will be technically more difficult to recover. So a good portion should not be counted. But they have fields with good oil. Eastern Russia and so on have very good fields with lighter oil that should be producible, less cost, and so on. So those are the reserves that will probably remain. That's why it's still a country that should have 40
Yeah,
billion barrels in reserves.
barrels.
That's a lot. It's just nowhere close to what they're declaring.
So
And the
both
same
Russia.
goes true. The same is true if you go to look at Saudi Arabia, which we talked about. Saudi
uh
Arabia, and then the countries around there. If you look at that, a lot of their production nowadays is enhanced oil recovery. It used to be that they say, "Oh, in Saudi Arabia, you drill a well and the oil just flows up like magic." Forget it; those days are gone. That's not reality in Saudi Arabia anymore. More and more, they have to do water injection, and water injection in their carbonate reservoirs is not so effective when you use seawater. And so they have to do a lot of desalination, bring water from way far away. Those are technical restrictions, and they impact costs because now water becomes very expensive. And so a lot of those fields that people used to say, "Oh, their lifting costs are $10 a barrel," forget it, not anymore. You know that I've said lifting costs in Brazilian pre-salt around $5 or less. In Saudi Arabia, they're probably 12, maybe more, and
Wow.
and going up. And this is something people don't realize. And it's not just the lifting costs; those are dramatically difficult producing conditions. They're bringing new fields on, which they say will add to reserves, but not really. A lot of those fields are probably already counted in their reserves. It's just that they're finally putting them in production, and with very difficult production parameters. So, they're almost 300 billion barrels. I would take up to a half off. It's going to be very difficult. And a lot of those reserves cannot be produced in the next 30, 40 years. After 40 years, maybe we'll have the technology, but will we still have the economic viability for that production?
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
that's questionable. So Saudi Arabia for me is another country that,
Another country. So
at
you
least
mentioned
30% off.
you mentioned Russia, Venezuela, and Saudi Arabia. These three countries are lying in terms of reserves.
Boy, it's a strong word, but there's no other word that applies.
Yeah,
Their
yeah.
assessments are completely imaginary, and they did not review them on purpose. I mean, they could review them very easily and recognize, for example, like I said, 70% is not viable. They would still have gigantic reserves. 40 or 50 billion barrels is a lot.
Oh,
And in
sure.
Saudi Arabia, maybe 50 billion barrels. And
Four times Brazil.
well, in Saudi Arabia, their reserves, even if you adjust, they might still be 150,
Oh,
maybe 180 billion barrels. That's ridiculous amounts, high, but they are much less than the close to 300 billion barrels they declare. So I think it's an inaccuracy that you purposefully decide to leave there. That's a lie, because it really
yeah,
only impacts image, and they were very concerned about that. But in terms of production, they will continue producing what they're producing now. Maybe they can increase it a little bit. They will have big problems going forward, but they don't want to face the facts, and they don't want to tell people that, our reserves are not 300, they're 150 or 180. That's the explanation.
uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh. But Cleveland, considering the transition to renewables, this is not a transition itself. It's something. It's an addition of energy that we are bringing to the world. Uh, how long these reserves, the truth reserves, can let's say support the society demands? Uh,
Yeah,
is it
the
possible
thing
to
is,
have this
the reserves calculation that people do is the current amount of world reserves divided by the current world production.
production?
So on that basis, we have uh, almost 100 years, because of course we have those gigantic numbers from the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, Iraq, and those are also very imaginary. But the point is that even if reserves come down a lot, production is not always going to stay at 100 million barrels a day. It will eventually, maybe in 10, 20, 30 years, it will come down. So you won't have the 50 or 100-year reserve ratio, but you might still have, 50 years or whatever. In any
Uh-huh.
case, I think the best answer is that the world will not run out of oil because it ran out of reserves. It will still have oil in the ground when we dwindle production down to the level where we just won't need a lot of the reserves that are in the Middle East and other countries. Unfortunately,
Similar to Stone's area.
yeah, was it Yamani said the world, the Stone Age ended not because of the lack of stones. It's the same thing with oil. There's plenty of oil. It may be less than people claim, but it still will get us to the eventual transition. I'm not even talking about the current energy transition we envision in 2030 or 2050. I'm saying in 2100, at the end of the century, there will still be plenty of oil there. And by then, certainly very much less oil demand. There may still be oil demand, but
Sure.
much, much less. So the oil won't run out, but the demand will come down, and you certainly won't need billions, millions of barrels all over the place. Oh, another country, um, uh, let's show here, Canada. Yeah, oil sands are 97% of Canada's calculated reserves. And we know the oil sands are just not going to be viable very long. They can produce them at great cost, steam production, all of this kind of stuff. Environmental concerns might, even in Alberta, eventually that might be a problem. So technically recoverable, yeah, they might be. Economically viable, they are for now. I don't think they will remain viable for long because environmental concerns will make that production expensive. There might even be environmental restrictions applied. So, Canada is another country. Their reserves are significant, but they can probably be written off because 90% of those reserves just won't count.
Wow.
It won't matter much because they're not producing for 5 million barrels a day, but it's certainly nowhere
But
close to
but
what they're
professor,
declaring.
I can understand very easily that Venezuela, Russia, and Saudi Arabia make this kind of a, let's see, quote line, but Canada,
No, but see, in Canada's case, I think that it's maybe a wider lie because that is a more recent assessment of the oil sands when unconventionals became really the hot thing, and when unconventionals in Canada, meaning the oil sands, became technically recoverable with steam injection and so on, those resources technically became recoverable. And at the oil prices near $100,
okay,
they are economical. The only thing is that I'm saying those reserves won't remain reserves for very long. They may technically count as reserves today because
okay,
economic and technical viability, but they are dwindling fast because they will not be producible for very long because their costs will go up, their restrictions will go up. So technically, they will have to apply methods that will be making those very expensive. They may even be prevented from producing. Canada has a very strong east-west dichotomy. The east is against that exploration. The west wants to produce that oil. Eventually, it's not a question that the east is going to prevail. It's just that the world is going towards cleaner fuels, and oil sands and tar sands are just not it. Especially when you have so many other fields, deep water fields with light oil, very inexpensive, like the Gulf of Mexico, west coast of Africa, east coast of Brazil. You can't compete with that oil. And when things get tough, which production is going to have to be shut in? The production which is less efficient, more expensive, more problematical, more environmentally harmful. That's the first production that will have to go out. And then all of those resources that were going to be produced are going to have to be whittled down and say, okay, sorry, they're not going to count as reserves anymore. Maybe in 5 years, Canada will face reality. They don't have to face it today or now, but
mhm.
in the next few years, I'm sure they will.
So if the price go very fast to the other level, let's say $200 per barrel, so these reserves must be reviewed.
That's a good point because that's what a lot of people are saying. Oh, but oil prices will go beyond 100 or 150 and so on. There's a saying: oil prices are the best cure. High oil prices are the best cure for high oil prices. So if oil prices go to 150 or 200, we have crises, problems. All it won't last long. We have many alternatives in the world. They just won't come on for a year or two or five. But if oil prices tend to go way above $100, then a lot of the unconventional energy alternatives will come up as being very much more viable than those oil resources.
Okay.
So
Okay.
even if the oil price stays at 150, well, then a lot of the other energies, bioenergy from sugarcane or anything else, and wind energy and so on will again become so fantastically economically viable that they will supersede the oil production
Yeah,
that just
but
became viable.
the reserves should be recalculated with a new level of price.
if they are to be recalculated, they will do so for 2 or 3 years, because in two or
Okay.
three years, the oil prices will come back down to 100 or so, because the alternative energies will bring up the supply, and then things will even out again. Those oil prices cannot stay at 150 or more. They just won't. They may stay for a short period of time until the other resources come up and fill that supply gap,
Make
and
a balance.
probably
Yeah.
faster than the oil sands can come up in production,
Yeah.
faster than China can ramp up their production. That's a problem with the oil resources in the world. It
Hmm.
takes a relatively long time to ramp up, and nowadays the alternative energies take less time to ramp up. So if oil prices really jump up, the other energies can jump in a lot quicker and provide
Sure.
the energy, and oil prices will have to come back down because the demand
More
for
more
those
viable. Yeah.
resources will come down.
Perfect.
You can't violate the laws of economics. You make something very much more attractive, and it will be produced. And that's the problem with the high oil prices. It stimulates alternative production.
Hmm. Hmm. Perfect. You-
Um, you know,
Yeah.
that all sounds like a lot of bad news, but I want to say that there are good news, and I've said this many times. The Brazilian pre-salt is a good news. The declared reserves in Brazil, are barely over 12 billion barrels. That's nothing. We know that in the pre-salt alone, there are over 120 billion barrels yet to be discovered that will be added to reserves just from drilling in the pre-salt, where we know prospects have been identified. This is a 90% certainty that those resources will be discovered, because we
And,
know
and,
there's
and
between
what's missing?
170 and 270
And,
billion barrels there. We've
and,
discovered some, we've produced some. It's just math. It can't
and
ignore that.
what's missing to have this? Let's see, total verification to have
Oh,
this
it will take
results.
some years. I mean, if oil prices were to go up, of course, that will be speeded up.
Yeah.
It just takes more drilling, more development, more investment from majors, from Brazilian Petrobras. That will happen in 5 or 10 years. Adding 120 billion barrels to reserves isn't tomorrow or next year. Those reserves will be added over the next 10 years or 15 years, but they will be added because we
It's a
know they're
big
there.
number. It's a big number.
It's a big
10 times.
number, but 120 billion barrels is still less than what we cut off Venezuela, what we
Yeah.
cut off Saudi Arabia, but the point is that there are some areas that
is
are going
is
up.
is this is the reason that Brazil is joining OPEC?
No, I think it's much more political and
Yeah.
geopolitical maneuvering, and I think it's fine. I don't think it changes anything. Brazil won't produce more or less. It won't be bound by OPEC restrictions. It won't benefit from OPEC. And so the joining is maybe
Political.
feathers being shown and say, hey, look, we can join OPEC.
Uh-huh.
Production now 5 million barrels a day. It's still going up fast. By the end of the decade in 2030, it's probably going to be 6, maybe 7,
Mhm.
and it's going up. And with exploration work that is still going on,
Mhm.
those prospects that we know are there will be declared. In Brazil, there's a very strong bias against making declarations, because any companies that do seismic work and identify giant fields and so on, they are very reluctant to declare reserves until they do a lot of drilling, and then they ask for more time for
Yeah.
confirmation, because as soon as they declare reserves, then ANP, the Brazilian national oil entity,
Agency.
comes in and says, now you have to invest so many billions in development.
Oh,
They don't want to be bound by that. They
yeah.
know they have the discoveries there on paper. They just don't want to have to declare them. But, at least 10, 30 billion are known. And with more exploration, that 118 billion barrels, 90% confidence level, will
Impressive.
be found between now and 20, 30 years. It's going to be
Impressive.
added. But that's also the case in the Gulf of Mexico, which is one bright area in the U.S. That will also be going up. Um, Guyana, Suriname, opa. Let me go back here.
Sure.
The pre-salt, Guyana, Suriname, they've got something like 10 billion barrels that I identified. They can add another 20 billion barrels just in the areas that are there shown that the companies are working, because they've declared reserves in the fields that they've worked extensively. And just like in Brazil,
Yeah.
once they really know the area and is very sure, they declare those reserves. But there's a
Mhm.
lot of areas there that can be declared with just a little bit more confirmation. And so that's another region that can probably, Suriname and Guyana together can probably add another 20 billion barrels, maybe
This
more.
this this is without Maduro's interference, no?
Even with, I mean, he can talk all he wants. That Venezuela will have no impact on the Guyana Suriname situation. Um, and in fact, I think he has only harmed the position for Venezuela, because it's just making it more and more hard for Venezuela to produce the little production that it can produce now, a million
Yeah,
barrels a day. And it's making it very difficult, isolating itself. And so all of the reserves that we discussed, which are very significant, for
yeah.
Venezuela, like I said, very unlikely that they will eventually be produced, mostly for geopolitical reasons. So that's out of
And
his mouth where the
and
problems come.
and the quality of oil in this region,
Very
is it
good.
good? Oh yeah,
This region has oil that is equivalent or similar to the pre-salt, very light,
oh,
good oil, and
carbonatic
probably very, very low cost extraction. Also,
extraction.
I haven't seen those numbers, so I can't say for sure. But certainly, I don't know if they'll be as low as the pre-salt, but it's going to be very economical, low cost production.
Interesting, interesting.
So the reserves that will be added there will be very resilient, meaning that they will be resistant to low prices. They will be long lasting because those fields will produce for
Yeah,
15, 20 years or more. They are in relatively safe regions, despite what we hear Venezuela talk. And of course, they are in an established province where the Exxon and all those other companies working there already have contracts that are defensible, good operating conditions. So very, very
yeah.
good region to increase
Region
reserves just by
reserves.
regular exploration work.
And you mentioned Gulf of Mexico. You have a picture of that?
I
No,
don't know if I
no.
have a picture of the Gulf of
Oh,
Mexico, but look, there's a
uh-huh.
very interesting thing that came out maybe a year or two or three ago, where I think it was Rystad said that the oil reserves in the United States are larger than Saudi Arabia. And
Uh-huh.
based on what? Based on a lot of the oil shale that is currently providing most of the growth and production. They
Mhm.
don't talk very much about the Gulf of Mexico, but that is an area that can add probably another 10 or 20 billion barrels, very low cost, long. The advantage is offshore, long term production. You discover a field in the Gulf of Mexico and it will produce for 10, 15, maybe 20 years at low cost. If you produce in a new area in the Barnett and all of these areas, it will produce a very short period and you have to intensively work it. It's very economical so far. And on that basis, they suggested, they did not do an assessment like the oil and so on, but they suggested that the reserves are, over 100 billion barrels or more, 200 billion barrels. I, of course, don't take those numbers very seriously because I think ultimately a lot of the unconventional shale plays in the U.S. might taper off. They will
Yeah,
become more difficult to work with. For oil production, water will be a major problem. Water for injection and water for and disposal of the water. Those issues will increase in cost tremendously. just like Saudi Arabia, and that might make some of the production questionable. But some of the other areas with shale plays in the U.S. have actually been scaled down in reserve estimates because they've recognized, hey, these are not areas that are going to be producing very long and not as much as we thought. Some areas have been whittled down 90% by the USGS,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
reserves that were calculated. So we see,
perfect.
at least in the US, there's a very dynamic situation where they raise the reserves
Yeah,
where it's convenient and likely, and they lower them elsewhere. But this is a Rystad number, and
yeah,
I think they're respectable, but I think they probably went overboard. But it's to say that the United States
yeah,
can add a lot of resources into
yeah.
production
That
over the next few
that's a good
years.
point.
Maybe in 10 years' time, they will have to remove them. That's
We have a question from a person here, Bark Cashley. Late President Chavez decided to triple the volume of Venezuelan crude oil reserves in less than a year, in retaliation to Saudi's oil raising reserves for the objectives of higher OPEC quota.
Yeah, it was very, of course, it was in their interest and they wanted to do that. It didn't help much because Venezuela is a lost case anyway, and their production is close to a million, and it's going to be very hard to get it even to 2 million,
Yeah,
But naturally, it's the game everybody plays. Oh, we have giant reserves, so we should be able to produce a lot. And they're still part of OPEC. So, yeah, it's
but
very
the,
likely
yeah,
geopolitics
yeah,
play.
but they are increasing very fast the production from 700 barrels per day to 1 million something, with the
Yes,
help and
but
support of United
Cavagna, they
States, I
were
suppose.
three. They were at 3, 4 million barrels. I mean,
Yeah,
coming back exactly to where they were is not even possible. To half of what they were, maybe one and a half, two
one and
million.
something.
I think
Yeah,
will be a tremendous challenge. That's like
yeah,
two 2 years worth of work to come
yeah.
back to 2 million, maybe.
I,
You know,
I yeah, I have a geopolitics question for you, please. Considering the North America and South America reserves, so if we join efforts and being friendly in a supply chain, friendly supply chain, isn't necessary to go to Saudi Arabia and other parts of the world. So we are, let's see, self-sufficient in terms of America. Why we do not do this exercise?
Yeah, good question. I like that very much because we spoke about that when a couple times ago when we discussed winners and losers, and I said, of course, there are going to be a lot of losers in the world production scenario, because things are changing, and companies and countries have to have energy security. So
Yeah,
part of that is to source their oil supplies from more than one source. I don't think they need to
yeah,
source it from 10, but they don't they can't be relying only on one or two areas, maybe three areas or so. And we also
perfect.
discussed that East and West Africa could come up in production and also in reserves. So that's an area that makes sense for countries and companies to rely on importing oil when they need it from
Neighbors.
those regions
Yeah,
too, just to provide some equilibrium
yeah,
and
yeah,
mitigate risk.
yeah. Perfect, perfect. Yeah, perfect. Uh, Nicola from hey, oh hey, Nicola, thank you for coming. If
Yeah.
you have a question or a comment, please welcome. Oh, he's a long timer, Armando. Oh yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to have you here, Nicola.
Yeah.
And good text, Professor Cleveland. What else you have for us today?
Well, I think that's it. I mean, we have to understand that the oil and gas reserves of individual countries, are very different from their declared values and generally accepted values. But the overall reserves of the world will still be sufficient to easily produce during the oil age, which may be until the end of the century. to produce what the world needs. It's just that that oil production will come from new regions. And
Good
those are the
conclusion.
ones we mentioned when we mentioned the winners. A lot of the east coast of Brazil, the Gulf of Mexico, Guyana, East and West Africa, maybe some Southeast Asia, and a lot of the established players, their reserves will be relatively meaningless if they become technically or economically not viable. So it's just a question of recognizing reality, writing up or writing down reserves. Right now, of course, no country has an incentive to write down the reserves. So you and I and other researchers have to take this issue and say, for this and for that reason, we believe Saudi Arabia, Russia, and so on,
Mhm.
Venezuela, even some onshore plays in the U.S.
Mhm.
Canada are overestimated, and on the other hand, some other regions will come up. They may not still match current numbers, but they will even out to provide the world with oil supply as it still needs during that slow energy transition, and it will be slow. I mentioned a while back that I'm confident we can get to net zero. I don't think it's that important, but I think we can get there because I think other things are more important. But we can get there even, with the oil that we have, with the alternative energies that will become economical. Certainly, they will become viable faster if oil prices are higher, but they will come down in price, and the oil will slowly become less and less in demand. And by the end of the century, maybe a very small amount will be required, but it's a slow downward slope. And the world will be just fine in terms of what oil is available to be produced. Price wise, it's very difficult to imagine prices going up very high because they can't stay there very long. But the rearrangement of the reserve numbers is important to consider, even if the countries don't agree. Russia is not going to agree. Saudi Arabia is not going to agree that the
Yeah.
reserves are half. But that's
So
reality.
the conclusion could be that although some countries are not, let's see,
Totally honest.
being, yeah, exactly, not being truth, the total reserves are enough to pass this transition and to go
Yes. So
further.
the total reserves, we're counting like 1.5 trillion or whatever. They don't need to be that. They certainly aren't 1.5 trillion. But between the ups and downs, if they are between 800
800,
and a trillion, that's fine. It will be enough to carry us
enough.
into the end of the oil age. No problem. No worries there. The worries that we have to have is the
uh,
technology to make new energies meet the challenge as oil decreases.
yeah, yeah, including the intermittent ones that we are trying to develop here in wind and
Sure.
solar. Yeah, good.
Definitely. Very
Thank
good.
you, Professor Cleveland Jones. Was a pleasure again to have you in this conversation.
Okay, until next time, Cavagna.
Next
Thank you
time.
very much. Best
Thank
to
you.
all.
Yeah, and have a good new year.
Yes, to all of us.
Yeah, thank you.